A ceasefire between Libya's rival forces is set to be signed today in Moscow, raising hope for a political solution to the conflict. French President Macron hosts African leaders to boost the fight against the jihadists in the Sahel. And more protests in Iran over the airplane shootdown. Hello and a warm welcome to Africa Live on CGTN. I'm Lindy Mtongana in Nairobi. Also coming up this hour. In business, Sudan opens up the gold trade to mop up foreign currency. And in sports, Nigerian representatives at the CAF Awards criticized for not showing Asisat Oshoala full support. In our top story this hour, Libya's rival forces are expected to sign a ceasefire deal in Moscow today. On Sunday, Libya's Government of National Accord, the GNA, issued a statement accepting the ceasefire agreement just hours after rival forces announced a cessation of hostilities.
The Russian-Turkish brokered ceasefire came into effect over the weekend, but tensions remain high. Both sides are accusing each other of violations.
We are committed to the truce, but the enemy is still active. The blood of martyrs will not be lost. We are waiting for further instructions.
The ceasefire comes more than 9 months after forces loyal to Khalifa Haftar began their offensive in Tripoli. The leader of the Libyan National Army has been looking to topple Prime Minister Faiz al-Sarraj. If signed, the truce will pave way for the revival of the political process and bring calm to the oil-rich nation. More than 300 people have been killed and thousands of Libyans displaced. The ceasefire has taken a hand of many African and European nations. But the two major power brokers have been Turkey and Moscow. Presidents of the two countries called for the truce last week in Istanbul. In January, Ankara dispatched military support to the GNA. Moscow has repeatedly been accused of helping Haftar. Libya has remained split between the two fighting rival administrations, who stepped in to fill a political void left after the death of former ruler Muammar Gaddafi. Chamgono, CGTN.
Well, let's bring you more on this story now. We're joined by our correspondent, Michal Bardavid in Istanbul. Michal, we of course have seen intense diplomatic efforts to try and resolve the Libyan conflict over the past few days. But just tell us more specifically what role Turkey has played in this peace process.
Well, it seems that, Lindy, right now Turkey's role is very critical, especially together with Russia. As we just listened to this news package, the Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Istanbul on Wednesday, and the decision for a ceasefire was made following their call for this to happen on January 12th at midnight. So they've really been taking on a leading role, and they've managed to do this despite being on opposing sides of the Libyan conflict. Now, Turkey is one of the main supporters of the UN-backed Government of National Accord, while Moscow is supporting the Libyan National Army of General Khalifa Haftar. But it's also important to say that Libya right now is very critical for Turkey as well. It's very significant. Turkey believes it can make a strategic move, especially in the Mediterranean, with the support of Libya. Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan in November signed a maritime boundary agreement with the GNA, and that is a strategic move for Turkey not to be excluded from the Mediterranean. And it's also important to note that the Turkish parliament has also approved a motion for Turkish troops to be able to deploy inside Libya to support the GNA. And Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan has already stated that this deployment has begun. So even though Turkey is very supportive of a diplomatic solution, if this ceasefire fails, it's also really critical to understand that Turkey is ready to support the GNA in whatever way they can. Lindy?
And of course, what happens in Libya is of concern to other countries too. We know Italy's Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte is planning to visit Turkey on Monday. What issues is he expected to raise with regards to Libya?
Yes, the Italian Prime Minister Conte is expected to meet with Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan in 1 hour in Ankara. It was already reported that the Italian Foreign Minister Luigi Di Maio had suggested that a trilateral mechanism be formed between Italy, Turkey and Russia in regards to Libya. So really, Italy wants to take on a leading role, and it has already tried to take on a mediator role last week, but had failed once the Prime Minister Fayez Sarraj of the Government of National Accord discovered that Haftar had been invited to Rome before him, so these talks had failed. But as you mentioned, for Italy, it is very critical what happens in Libya, as Italy is one of the countries most impacted, as Libyan refugees frequently arrive to the shores of Italy. So that really creates a potential for a refugee crisis for Italy. So it seems that here in Turkey, Conte and Erdogan will be discussing ways to cooperate and try to find a way for the democratic stability to be formed in Libya much easier.
Michal David, thank you so much for that update, joining us there live from Istanbul. Now, there are doubts that this ceasefire will last long. Our Cairo correspondent, Adel Al-Mahri, has been following the story for us.
With Turkey's intentions to send forces there, the civil war in Libya was about to shift into an international conflict. Egypt responded to Turkey by displaying its military power in the Mediterranean, but suddenly the rising tension appeared to be diffusing, with both rival parties agreeing to a ceasefire last Saturday.
The declaration of the ceasefire was sponsored by several international efforts. Germany is leading consultations to host talks between rival Libyans in Berlin. With the recent tensions rising, England, France and China moved with Russia to broker this temporary truce.
The sounds of gunfire and missiles around Tripoli are finally quiet now, but analysts don't believe this will last.
Theoretically, the possibility of such a ceasefire to last is slim. It's very difficult. We are not talking about fully organized military forces that the government manages. These are militias who belong to numerous ideologies. Some of them are Al-Qaeda, others are Brotherhood, and some are mercenaries. There isn't anything that guarantees a lasting truce.
There seemed to be an international determination, though, to maintain the truce. Tunisia and Algeria have both refused to allow Turkish forces to reach Libya through them. Germany's Chancellor Merkel has spoken to Egyptian President El-Sisi on Sunday to exclusively discuss the ceasefire which Cairo has blessed. And Russia is hosting Haftar and Sarraj in a round of talks that would hopefully see a truce signed.
Russia's role in many conflicts is decisive. It's a balancing power to the United States, which is seeing retreating influence in the region. I think now, while there is chaos in the US administration, the Russian role could be very effective.
This temporary ceasefire doesn't mean that Libyans are coming together. During the weekend, the head of the Libyan parliament said they could ask the Egyptian military to intervene if necessary, while the LNA and GNA both warn of violent response if the other breaches the ceasefire. Many fear this tension could once again spark the civil war in Libya. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
Well, let's bring you some analysis now on these recent developments. We're joined from Cairo by Dr. Gamal Abdel Gawad, a senior research fellow and academic advisor at the Al Ahram Center for Political and Strategic Studies. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Gawad. Now, this truce is obviously a very positive development in Libya, but it doesn't erase the tension that exists between the East and West governments. Do you think this ceasefire will hold in the long run?
Well, I don't think this is likely. The conflict in Libya is multidimensional, and so far none of those dimensions have been addressed. This is a power struggle. This is a struggle over the wealth of Libya. There is an ideological dimension to this conflict. There is a regional and international dimension to it. There is the Mediterranean gas dimension, where different nations are competing to have hold and have shares of this. None of those issues have been addressed so far, and I don't think this truth can survive until particularly the regional and international actors reach some sort of a compromise among themselves, which looks very far at the moment.
When it comes to some of the regional actors that are involved in this, we've of course seen Egypt attempt to play an important role as a peace bringer, as a power broker. But in the end, it was Putin and Erdogan that were able to bring these rival sides together. What influence do these two leaders have on Libya?
Those are the, on a distance, sponsors of the two sides of the conflict in Libya. Recently, Turkey has strongly intervened in the conflict in the side of the government of Faiz al-Sarraj in Tripoli. And Russia, for long, has been providing support for General Haftar and his troops, whether by equipment or by allowing Russian paramilitary, non-formal fighters to join the military effort of Haftar there. So yes, they have a leverage over the forces on the two sides. But again, this is just one element to the conflict. They can bring truce, but bringing a final, lasting settlement for this conflict is something else completely.
Right. Well, thank you so much for that analysis. Dr. Gamal Abdel Gawad joining us there live from Cairo. Now, French President Emmanuel Macron is due to host his counterparts from 5 Sahel countries in the southwestern city of Pau. The leaders from Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger and Chad will be discussing the fight against armed groups and the French military presence in the region. Macron's meeting with the Sahel leaders was initially scheduled for mid-December, but it was postponed after 71 Niger troops were killed in an attack. Despite the creation of the G5 Sahel task force and the presence of 4,500 French soldiers and UN peacekeepers, the jihadist groups in the region have stepped up their attacks. Well, for more on this now, we're joined by CGTN's Ross Cullen in Paris. Ross, to begin with, can you give us more details about this meeting in Pau in southern France and just what's at stake for France?
Yeah, hi Lindy. Well, President Macron of France is going to be hosting those 5 leaders from Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger and Chad, looking for clarity from the presidents when it comes to the issue of the presence of French troops in their countries. We have seen some growing hostility, particularly in Mali and Niger, demonstrations against France, burning of the French flag, chanting of anti-French slogans, asking for the troops to leave. So President Macron will be looking for an assurance when it comes to this issue and saying that the possibility of the withdrawal of those 4,500 French troops stationed in the region is one that is on the table. They're there to try to provide security for the region and then as a result of that security for Europe as a whole. And we have seen, though, this problem of the attacks by armed groups loosely associated with Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, fatal attacks on the general public as well, of course, as troops are focused for those attacks as well. You mentioned the 71 Nigerian troops who died last year. We also saw 13 French troops killed when 2 helicopters collided. So it is a volatile situation at the moment in the Sahel region, and this meeting between Mr. Macron and the 5 other leaders is going to be crucial to try to map out a path forward when it comes to this Operation Barkhane, the presence of French troops in the region to try to provide security and stability for those countries in the Sahel.
And of course, you mentioned, Ross, that growing hostility on the ground in the Sahel to the presence of French troops. But what about the feeling in France? I mean, is there a lot of support for France's continued military involvement in the Sahel region?
Well, we have heard calls so far from one of the far left parties for the immediate return of those French troops. But if you look at a poll that was taken in 2013 compared with a poll that was taken in 2019 on that question, asking Lindy about the support for French troops in the region, it's more or less the same, and a majority in favour of the majority of the respondents in favour of the overall idea of the mission, that providing security in the Sahel can lead to increased security in Europe, supporting the presence of French troops. Of course, that's set against the mourning that we've seen, the pictures when the 13 French troops who died towards the end of last year, when they were repatriated, and the awarding of the Légion d'honneur, France's highest honour to the fallen troops, set against these grand palatial where the military museum is. Those images, of course, show to France the sacrifice of the troops. They're trying to help with the security and stability in the region. But when you look at it overall, seems to be a majority of people overall in favour of this mission. But Mr. Macron is going to be looking to the future and saying that if it's not entirely working the way it is at the moment, is it open to restructure the mission perhaps? We've got 4,500 French troops there at the moment. He's looking for more support from other Western countries. Britain provides some logistical support. There's intelligence as well, analysis provided by the United States in the region. But Mr. Macron would like to see more support from other Western countries. So it's going to be interesting to see the two sides to that. If he can shore up support here at home for the mission, as well as looking for clarity this afternoon in those meetings with the 5 leaders when it comes to France's presence in the region, set against what is seen to be growing hostility within those countries in the Sahel.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Ross Cullen, joining us live from Paris. You're watching Africa Live. Time now for a short break. Coming up, ministers of Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan are due in Washington to finalize an agreement on the Nile Dam project. And more protests in Iran over the airplane shootdown.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
We start first with returning to our top story this hour, where Libya's rival forces are expected to sign a ceasefire deal in Moscow today. On Sunday, Libya's Government of National Accord, the GNA, issued a statement accepting that ceasefire agreement, which effectively starts from January 12th, and that was just hours after rival forces announced a cessation of hostilities. Well, let's bring you more on this now. We cross over live to Moscow, where Lucy Taylor is standing by with more for us. Lucy, give us more details on these talks due in Moscow. Will the rival leaders actually be meeting face to face?
Yes, we're told they will be. We haven't seen it yet. The Russian authorities have released pictures of the Russian and Turkish foreign and defense ministers having talks already. And around that table, there seem to be empty chairs, which presumably are for these two Libyan leaders. We're told they are both in Moscow and they will be meeting face to face. They may even be signing that formal ceasefire agreement that has been agreed over the weekend. This is part of a flurry of diplomatic efforts around the region, also involving the European Union. But this in particular is the product of a proposal by the Russian and Turkish presidents who met in Istanbul last week and suggested this ceasefire. This will be just the very beginning of the process. Even if that ceasefire agreement is signed today, it could be very difficult to enforce because of the complicated situation in Libya, the splintering of the different factions there. But President Putin met the German Chancellor Angela Merkel on Saturday and discussed the possibility of intra-Libya talks to be hosted in Berlin, led by the United Nations. That would be probably the next step if these two leaders agree the ceasefire today. But of course, they both have to be on board for that to happen. So I think these talks will not just focus on the immediate ceasefire, but also the shape of any possible peace talks, what they might look like and when they might happen.
And indeed, Lucy, the recent and ongoing developments in regards to this ceasefire have really highlighted the influence Russia has in this situation. Moscow has established itself as a key player in Libya, but tell us more about Moscow's role in the whole process and why Russia is so keen to see a political solution to the Libyan crisis.
Well, in a joint statement released last week with the Turkish president, Russia and Turkey are seen to support different sides in Libya, but the presidents met last week in Istanbul to discuss this whole situation. And they said that their aim was to end the suffering of the people of Libya. They want to see the establishment of a political process, they said, because further military action could only cause more suffering. Turkey is supporting the UN-backed government in Tripoli. Russia is seen to be supporting the other side of that, but they are cooperating in the same way that they have done in Syria. So this could potentially be a fairly significant movement. There might be further reasons why Russia wants to be involved in this way. Libya is very strategically important in the region, of course. It has the largest oil reserves in Africa also. So there may be other reasons why Russia would see it as prudent to get involved at this point, but Vladimir Putin's stated aim at the moment is to end the suffering of the Libyan people.
Lucy Taylor, thank you so much for that update, joining us there live from Moscow. Now, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has agreed to assist the Ethiopian government in solving its standoff with Egypt over the massive Nile Dam project. Egypt is blaming Ethiopia for the failure of the latest round of talks on the construction of the dam. Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali called on Ramaphosa to intervene during talks at the Union Buildings in Pretoria on Sunday. CGTN's Yolisa Jamela has more.
Once the pomp and ceremony was done and dusted, the two leaders got on with the business of the day. A number of issues had to be attended to. These include the official business of the state visit. The two governments signed a number of agreements to enhance cooperation, including on tourism and health.
This morning's meeting with President Cyril Ramaphosa has been a great opportunity to further solidify the long-standing relations between our two countries. Beyond elevating our economic and political ties, we also explored ways of enhancing our people-to-people ties across and within our two countries.
A number of South African government departments have had valuable contact with their Ethiopian counterpart ministers and are making good progress in strengthening relations.
The discussions then moved to other critical matters affecting the continent. The official visit also afforded the two leaders an opportunity to discuss issues of mutual concern, and those issues include peace, security, and development on the African continent. These include the standoff between Egypt and Ethiopia over the Nile Dam project. The Ethiopian Prime Minister asked the South African President to facilitate a dialogue between Ethiopia and Egypt over that project. The construction of the dam, which promises to provide much-needed electricity to Ethiopia's people, has been a contentious point.
A solution is possible because the two countries are great countries, and the Nile River is important to both countries, and there must be a way in which their interests can be addressed, and there must be a way in which a solution can be found. As for ourselves, we are willing to play a role in facilitating whatever agreement that can be crafted.
It has also emerged here that Ethiopia will hold a parliamentary election in May or June, despite security and logistic concerns.
I think we will conduct election this year because this is constitutional mandate and we have to live up to the constitution. There might be lots of challenges, not only logistics, but also peace and security. But if there was no challenge, why we need to go to election? We need election because there is challenge and we want to confront it in a very democratic way.
The election will be the first under this Prime Minister, as he only took office in April 2018. Yolisa Jamela for CGTN in Pretoria, South Africa.
Meanwhile, foreign ministers of Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan are due to meet in Washington to finalize an agreement on that Nile Dam project. This according to a joint statement issued by the U.S. Treasury Department. Talks between the three countries failed to reach a consensus last week due to technical issues including the filling of the $4.6 billion Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is around 70% complete. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has hailed the unbreakable friendship between China and Zimbabwe. He was speaking after concluding wide-ranging talks with his Zimbabwean counterpart on Sunday evening. CGTN's Farai Mokutoya reports.
The two countries enjoy a 4-decade-long diplomatic relationship, which both sides are now keen to see enhanced.
We are looking forward to getting to greater heights between Zimbabwe and China.
Zimbabwe's foreign minister was giving an update after bilateral talks with Wang Yi, during which further trade and economic cooperation were high on the agenda.
China and Zimbabweans can see opportunities within each other, which others are not seeing. And we believe that the continuous collaboration of this scenario would enhance the identification of opportunities which avail themselves here in Zimbabwe and also in China. From agriculture to manufacturing to tourism to mining, and specifically even into the financial services sector and into the management of the macroeconomic environment. All these issues have been identified and have been discussed and shared mutually between the two parties.
Wang Yi said China supports Zimbabwe's efforts to uphold its sovereignty and national dignity. He backed calls for the removal of sanctions on Zimbabwe, which have no place in international law and which violate the rights of the country's citizens. He said China and Zimbabwe should stand together, especially in the face of rising unilateralism, Cold War mentality, and political bully tactics.
China and Zimbabwe have an unbreakable relationship. This year, we celebrate the 40th anniversary of diplomatic relations between China and Zimbabwe. Over the past 4 decades, China and Zimbabwe friendship has withstood the big tests and stormy weather, and both sides have stood firmly by this friendship. The most fundamental experience of that is the mutual respect, trust, and support that we have given each other all along.
After the day's hard work, it was time to unwind and toast to a great friendship.
A dinner hosted by Vice President Constantino Chiwenga capped off a fruitful day. On Monday, Wang Yi is due to meet President Emmerson Mnangagwa, the final official engagement of his African tour. Farai Mokutoya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
A second day of protests in Iran has turned violent as anger grows over the government's response to the downing of a Ukrainian jet. Iran's military admitted to mistakenly shooting down the plane last week. Pakistan's foreign minister met with Iran's president in Tehran on Sunday to try to ease tensions. Meanwhile, Ukraine's president says experts are working in Tehran to ensure the truth isn't covered up. Jessica King reports from Kiev.
In Tehran, protesters chanted death to the dictator and called for the resignation of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. They held vigils for the victims of flight PS-752. The plane en route to Kiev was shot down shortly after takeoff. Iranian officials say it was a disastrous mistake, following the US killing of an Iranian commander and retaliatory strikes. Meanwhile, Iran lawmakers have denied a cover-up and vowed to investigate the crash. Amid soaring international tensions, the leader of Qatar has arrived in Tehran, calling for peaceful solutions. The country is close to the US, but also has strong ties with Iran. World leaders have called for a full investigation into the disaster, with Canada's Prime Minister saying people are demanding answers and accountability.
We will continue to work with our partners to ensure that a full, transparent investigation is conducted. I want to assure all families and all Canadians, we will not rest until there are answers. We will not rest until there is justice and accountability.
In Ukraine, officials say they are investigating possible willful killing and aircraft destruction in their probe of the crash. The president is calling for the bodies of victims to be returned to Ukraine by the end of next week.
Я поверну всіх загиблих I will return all the dead to their families. They will be able to say goodbye to them humanely. We honor their memory. All perpetrators will be punished. We will give back to Ukrainians not only a sense of security and justice, but also certainty that Ukraine will always protect them in any corner of the planet.
Iran may have taken responsibility for such a tragic error, but there is still much anguish and grief that innocent lives were lost, and the diplomatic consequences may be severe.
Analyst Peter Zalmayev says Ukraine is once again entangled in international political disputes.
Ukraine may be used, and this tragedy may be used as a political tool in this tug of war between Iran and the US. So it's a very good question. Ukrainians are very wary of once again being used as some kind of a tool of pressure.
The Ukrainian government has allocated an initial amount of around $8,000 to the families of the Ukrainian victims, but they admit no amount of compensation will dull the pain. For now, prayer and mourning continues. Jessica King, CGTN, Kiev.
Well, time now for a short break. Your business news up next. Coming up, Sudan opens up the gold trade to mop up foreign currency. And Nigeria backs down on the $2 billion tax dispute with MTN.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Sudan has passed a new regulation that allows private traders to export roughly 70% of their gold. The new policy is designed to address smuggling and attract foreign currency into the country's cash-strapped treasury. Sudan's central bank was the only body that was legally allowed to buy and export gold. Only the bank could establish centers to purchase the precious metal from small-scale miners. But under the new law, private mining companies can export their products provided they deposited proceeds in local banks. In 2018, an estimated 93 tons of gold was produced in Sudan, making it Africa's third largest gold-producing nation. MTN Nigeria is set to begin the process of withdrawing its case against the Office of the Attorney General and the Minister of Justice. The move comes after the latter withdrew a tax demand against South African telecoms giant. Nonetheless, the case is not fully closed. Instead, MTN will now engage with Nigerian tax and customs authorities to solve the dispute. In 2018, Nigeria's Attorney General demanded $2 billion in tax arrears from MTN. However, Africa's largest mobile operator argued that the claim was without merit and was outside the authorities' jurisdiction. Shares in MTN Group rose by more than 4% upon the announcement. Nigeria is its biggest market with roughly 60 million users. And shifting our focus to Zimbabwe now, where government workers have rejected a 97% salary increment. The state workers argue that the offer falls far too short and is not enough to cushion them against soaring prices. At the moment, Zimbabwe is experiencing the worst economic crisis in nearly a decade. The Southern African economy reintroduced its local currency last year in June. This, however, has sparked increases in prices of basic goods and services, as well as inflation, which economists say reached 400% last November. Salaries have also lagged, angering workers. This includes teachers and mostly doctors at state hospitals who've remained on strike since last September. And on the international front, the world's top two economies are scheduled to sign a preliminary trade agreement this week. CGTN's Dan Williams now explores how this trade deal is expected to be a huge relief for American soybean farmers.
A freezing cold morning in Manhattan, Illinois, as John Kiefner begins the day on his 240-hectare farm. A third-generation farmer, Kiefner, along with other soybean farmers, has found himself on the front line of the trade dispute between the US and China.
We knew as soon as the trade war escalated and the price of soybeans dropped so bad that we were in trouble.
Following the Trump administration's decision to impose tariffs on Chinese imports, China responded by imposing retaliatory tariffs on a range of US goods, including soybeans. US soybean exports to China slumped from $12 billion worth in 2017 to just over $3 billion in 2018.
We've seen some lenders ask for better collateral. There have been some large farmers that have gone bankrupt. I'm old enough to remember embargoes with countries before, and you know that once you lose a buyer, it's really hard to get them back.
It has been a difficult few years for US soybean farmers, but as they begin their preparations ahead of the new planting season, this Phase 1 trade deal will at least give them a sense of optimism.
Bryce Knorr is a market analyst with Farm Futures magazine.
We've eliminated a big negative.
He says it could still take time for the world soybean market to become more stable.
There's still quite a bit of uncertainty moving forward. And again, but now we're going to be talking about acreage and profit and loss and maybe not trade so much. So I think that's a relief to anyone involved in agriculture.
Back in Manhattan, Illinois, Kiefner is simply looking to put 2019 behind him, a year also marked by poor weather, and begin growing his 2020 crop.
Resolving this trade war is definitely going to be a great step in the right direction. We're just going to grow, baby, grow.
There are still a number of unknowns for US soybean farmers, but most will begin the year with fresh hope. Dan Williams, CGTN, Manhattan, Illinois.
Germans may soon have to pay a deposit when they buy a new smartphone or tablet device. The move falls under a new proposal that aims to boost the recycling of used devices. The average European throws out about 20 kilograms of electrical waste a year. That's equivalent to roughly 2 microwaves. For more on this, here's CGTN's Rebecca Bundin.
Smartphones in Germany could become more expensive. The Green Party is proposing a new law forcing consumers to pay a €25 deposit on mobiles and tablets, which they'll only get back when they return the device for recycling.
We're looking at a general problem in Germany, but also across Europe, that we have too little recycling and too much waste, all in the e-sector, but also in other sectors. In the e-sector, the e-waste is a specific problem. We have a lot of resources which go into smartphones and other electronic goods, and they could be recycled.
It's estimated that German citizens produce an average of 20 kilos of electronic waste a year, and less than half of that gets recycled.
Many smartphones and tablets end up in landfills, or they're sent on to developing countries where labourers sometimes use dangerous chemicals to extract the different elements. But often discarded phones simply end up sitting in people's drawers as consumers try to keep up with the latest technology.
Some 24 million new smartphones are sold in Germany every year. There are small quantities of precious metals in each phone. Collectively, this amounts to 720 kilos of gold and 7.3 tons of silver, as well as hundreds of tons of aluminium and copper. Environmentalists say such materials can pollute groundwater and a lot can be reused. But not everyone's happy to fork out a deposit on a phone.
I don't think that everyone is able to pay these €25. It sounds like not much, but I feel like not everyone can afford a phone.
I'm personally for it. In any case, I'm not against it. Paying €25 wouldn't be a problem for me.
So considering the environment and the things that are happening, so I would not mind paying the deposit.
EU regulations have set an electronics recycling target of 65%. The German Green Party says strict measures are needed if that target is to be met. Rebecca Bunsen, CGTN, Frankfurt.
Well, time now for a short break. Here's what's still ahead on the program. Coming up, hundreds of Chinese in Uganda gather to celebrate the Chinese New Year.
Join us in Global Business and see Africa through our eyes.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Qanater this year
allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
Hundreds of Chinese living in Uganda have come together to celebrate the Chinese New Year. The celebration in the capital Kampala was painted red, and which is the main color for the festival. The celebrations usually last for more than 2 weeks. Leon Senyange reports.
The celebration of a new year. Hundreds of Chinese and Ugandans gathered here to enjoy the carnival atmosphere. The extravaganza was a blend of traditional Chinese customs that included dancing and feasting.
This is Guangdong food, okay? This is called baozi. This is for chanfen, okay? This is for pork feet, maybe some, and this is chicken feet.
In modern China, the celebration is also known as the Spring Festival. It can last for up to 16 days. This is the biggest Chinese New Year event ever celebrated here. It gives visitors the opportunity to learn lots about the Chinese culture, from food to trade and music too. An exciting experience for many, even for Zach Rubega, who tried his hand at Chinese calligraphy.
They're amazing. You just write as if you're writing symbols, symbols known to us, but in actual sense, they are characters and they have meaning.
These university students hope to get into the new Chinese year as a couple, acting a traditional Chinese marriage.
I've loved every second of having this experience. It's wonderful.
With the celebration also comes the hope for better things.
We always have our very many wishes, like making more money. And if you are a student, the study is doing more well, and the work is more goes well, kind of about health.
According to the Chinese zodiac calendar, 2020 will be the year of the rat, a symbol of wealth. Leon Senyange, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
Coming up in your sports news, up next.